Well, a feeling is not a fact, and our country is almost unique in people believing that global warming is not human cause.
Robert Kennedy Jr. is a lifelong advocate in the environmental movement. He began his activism at a young age thanks in part to memories of his dad prior to his father's assassination in 1968.
My father considered this part of our heritage and, our Purple Mountains majesty.
Kennedy says those who sponsor climate lies should be given the corporate death penalty, and he says people who care more about money than global well-being are...
Yeah, sociopaths.
And he warns that American values are under attack because of corporate influence.
It's hard to even claim that we have a democracy anymore in our country.
Kennedy also talks about his life and personal struggles.
I started taking drugs when I was young, soon after my dad died. But everybody has tragedy in their lives. The enemy of any productive life is self-pity.
And he reflects on the month he spent in a Puerto Rican prison thanks to his activism.
You asked what it was like. It was, for me, a wonderful experience.
We spoke to Robert Kennedy Jr., lawyer, activist, and radio talk show host in New York.
You're very passionate about the environment. Where does this passion come from? When did it start?
Well, I always knew that I was going to be an environmental advocate from when I was very young. In fact, when I was 8 years old, I wrote a letter to my uncle, President Kennedy, who was then in the White House, asking to talk to him about pollution issues. And I always saw pollution as theft. And I always thought, why should somebody be able to pollute the air, which belongs to all of us, or destroy a river or a waterway, which is supposed to belong to the whole community. They're part of the public commons. And the issues are all intertwined with democracy. The function of government is to protect the commons on behalf of all the people and make sure nobody can privatize it. But as democracy declines, as constitutional government declines, and tyranny emerges, one of the first characteristics of an emerging tyranny is the tendency for powerful private interests within a society to begin privatizing the commons and stealing them from the public. To me, it's the same as fighting for democracy. It's not just about, fighting for the fishes and the birds. It's about fighting for all of the values that we believe in.
It's still a lot, though, for an 8-year-old to sort of be able to grasp. First of all, what did your uncle respond?
My uncle had me, I wrote that because there were cement plants on K Street in Washington, D.C. that were belching this very thick smoke that when we went to church in Washington on Sunday, it would blacken our shirts. And then a stream that I played in when I was a little boy was called Pimmet Run, that was a tributary to the Potomac. Got buried by road developers, and the animals in it that I used, the crayfish and the mud puppies, and there was an owl's nest up there, and it was all destroyed. So I wrote him a letter and said I wanted to write a book about pollution. He invited me to the White House, and I had a meeting with him in the Oval Office, and I have pictures of myself in my shorty shorts with my little...
And you're 8 years old.
I was 8. I brought him a salamander that I had caught the night before. But it had been killed by chlorine in the water that I brought him. So we spent a lot of the meeting talking about the health of the salamander. He said he didn't think it looked well, and I was saying, no, he's just sleeping. And afterwards, we released him in the Rose Garden fountain. But he arranged for me to, I said I wanted to do a book on pollution, and he arranged for me to meet with Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall, who was one of the great environmentalists in our nation's history, and also for Rachel Carson. She launched the modern environmental movement in our country.
And it sounds like all of this had quite an impact on you at a very sort of formative time in your life.
My father had a very big influence on us because he put us out in the wilderness so much, and he taught us how to whitewater kayak when we were very young. He'd take us fishing. He encouraged me in my interest in animals and wildlife. He took us mountain climbing and camping, and took us to some of the most beautiful, our national parks, and to do whitewater on the Salmon River and the Snake and the Colorado, the Little Colorado, the Yampa, the Green. That was a time when people weren't doing that kind of thing. And, but he wanted to show us this wilderness and say, this is part of your heritage. This is, American democracy is rooted in wilderness. That's what Frederick Jackson Turner, the great American historian, said, that in America, our democratic institutions are rooted in these vast tracts of wilderness and woodland. So my father considered this part of our heritage and, our Purple Mountains majesty, and he saw the destruction of those things, the short-sighted destruction by industry, as really an attack on American values and sovereignty.
Is global warming today the biggest threat?
I think global warming is the gravest threat to, the population is a threat. But global warming, it's the product of a war between old energy, between the carbon cronies, who, by the way, could not stay in business in a true free market capitalism because these new technologies like wind and solar can produce electrons and deliver them to their customers much more efficiently and much cheaper than the old energy economy. The only way that they maintain their foothold in our economy is through enormous subsidies and through the domination of the political process, through the subversion of democracy. If we could take the subsidies away from coal and oil, $1 trillion of subsidies every year that they get, they couldn't survive in the marketplace. We need a marketplace that does what a market is supposed to do, which is to reward good behavior, which is efficiency, and punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste. Right now, we have a marketplace that is governed by rules that were rigged by the carbon incumbents to reward the dirtiest, filthiest, most poisonous, most destructive, most addictive fuels from hell, rather than the cheap, clean, green, wholesome, and patriotic fuels from heaven.
What about the ordinary Americans, though, that believe that humans are not the cause of all of this? Is it their fault that they don't understand this? Don't they have a valid point in the sense that that's how they really feel?
Well, a feeling is not a fact. Our country is almost unique in people believing that global warming is not human cause. The rest of the world understands the connection. Science is facts, and the science is very clear, and the science is consensual. And the reason in this country that people don't believe that there are some people, large group of people, nearly 50% that don't accept the science behind global warming is because of propaganda. The companies like Exxon and the Koch brothers have spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the past, since 1997, in a concerted, deliberate effort to persuade Americans that global warming is a hoax. And they've used advertising, and they've set up these phony think tanks on Capitol Hill, and they stock them with these phony tobacco scientists that we call biostitutes, and very slick PR flacks, and voodoo economists, and all of these, this menagerie of kind of sociopaths who are taking money from the carbon industry.
Sociopaths?
Yeah, sociopaths, people who are putting their own interests, their own financial interests against the lives and the health of the society as a whole, people who are essentially antisocial.
Does that apply to everybody who works in the coal and oil industry, that they're all bad people, they're all sociopaths?
No, of course not. Most people who work in the coal industry, for example, coal miners, there's about 80,000 coal miners left in America. And most of those people are living in communities where they're desperate for jobs, where they really, and this is what they're trained for, and this is the work that they're doing. And depending on what kind of coal mining, it can be high-paying work or it can be very low-paying and dangerous work. Those are not bad people. I'm talking about the people who run these oil companies, particularly people like Lee Raymond, people like David Koch and Charles Koch, and the people who run these big think tanks on Capitol Hill, the American Enterprise Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Marshall Institute, who are very clever people who are deliberately lying to the American public, who are deliberately deceiving people in order to make sure that the high-level people in that industry continue to collect their income. So it's not the, it's not the lower tiers of the industry that I would say are bad people. I don't think that at all. I think they're just regular people who are like the rest of us, trying to make our way in the world and survive. But I think that the people who are conniving to lie to the American people, who are masterminding this massive propaganda campaign, that those are people who are sociopaths.
You wrote recently that corporations which deliberately, purposefully, maliciously, and systematically sponsor climate lies should be given the death penalty. Explain what you mean, and is there a precedent for this?
Yeah, corporations exist under charters that are issued by the state. It's essentially a license to do business in a particular state. And in every state that issues corporate licenses, the license requires that the corporation function for the public interest and that they cause no harm. So if a corporation begins to cause harm, or if they function against the public interest or conduct themselves in ways that are contrary to the public interest, the Secretary of State or the Attorney General of that state has the right to withdraw their charter. And if it's a foreign corporation, in other words, a corporation that is organized under the laws of the state, of a different state, but it has the right to operate in your state, your Attorney General can withdraw that operational license. And this has been done before. In 1998, the Republican Attorney General of the state of New York, Dennis Vacco, gave the corporate death penalty to the Tobacco Institute and to some of the other front groups for the tobacco industry. The Tobacco Institute was very, very effective. It essentially shielded the tobacco industry. This was an industry that was killing 1 out of every 4 or 5 of its customers. They used its product as directed. So the carbon industry, with much greater profits at stake and revenues at stake, is doing the same thing today. They've created a whole string, not just 2 or 3 of these front groups. They pretend to do science. They do fake science.
Coming up on Talk to Al Jazeera, we'll ask Robert Kennedy Jr. about some of the unique experiences of being a Kennedy. This is Talk to Al Jazeera. Welcome back. Our guest this week, Robert Kennedy Jr.
I want to ask you a little bit about your life story. The early 1980s, you were busted for heroin use.
I started taking drugs when I was young, soon after my dad died, and it was a struggle for me that I dealt with successfully when I was 29 years old.
A lot of people may not necessarily draw the connection between the unbelievable things you had to witness and go through as a child, the death of your uncle, the death of your father, and perhaps the connection with drug use.
I don't really think it had much to do with it. There's many, many people who have been through a lot worse things than I went through. I lost my dad when I was 14 and to violence, but there are millions of people living in the worst parts of our country and the most desperate parts of our country, in Harlem and Watts and Appalachia and in the migrant worker fields in the southern states or in Southern California, who lose their parents to disease or to violence that is a direct result of their poverty and desperation, and those kids don't have many of the advantages that I had. I had tragedy, but everybody has tragedy in their lives, and
But you also had to deal with it.
I also had a tremendous amount of support. I had a very, very strong family. I had the resources for a good education, and so I had advantages.
But there is something different about going through it in the very public manner in which your family has had to go through it.
There may be more hardship in going through it privately. So, everybody, like my mother says, everybody takes their licks, and the enemy of any productive life is self-pity. It's the adversary, and it's toxic, and that, we all everybody struggles with something. And it makes us the kind of people, that challenge and the experience in some cases of overcoming it are what builds our character and, and enriches our lives and makes us effective people.
You also spent time in a prison in Puerto Rico for some of your activism. What was that experience like?
I was representing 10,000 people on the island of Vieques who were being bombed by the Navy, and were experiencing devastating impacts. They had the highest unemployment in the Caribbean, the highest cancer rates in the Caribbean. Their food was poisoned with lead, with antimony, with arsenic. These are the byproducts of the detonation of naval ordnance. Their fisheries were being destroyed, their forests and their schools were being destroyed by the impact of the Navy's bombing. And this would not have happened. These were American citizens. I represented the people on the island to try to get the Navy to change some of its practices. We won our litigation, but the Navy continued. So the people on the island, led by the mayor of Vieques, asked me to engage in a civil disobedience, which I did. At the time, I said, how long do you think they'll put me in prison? And they said, probably 2 or 3 days, which was okay. I ended up having to go to jail for 34 days to maximum security prison in Puerto Rico. You asked what it was like. It was, for me, a wonderful experience.
Really?
It was very quiet. I had no cell phone. I had nobody asking me to make decisions. I got to read books that that had been sitting on my shelves for 20 years. And it was like almost going on a Catholic religious retreat that, which I used to go on when I was a kid. The people in the prison were, we all had meals together every day when they let us out of our cells. There was 140 people on the cell block, and about half of them, about 60 of them when I got there, were political prisoners, and the rest of them were gang members and people who had committed, in some cases, heinous crimes. But this kind of gestalt developed in the prison where we'd all watch the TV every night and watch the coverage on the protests against Vieques, and it kind of politicized everybody in that prison, and it brought them together, and it was really kind of an extraordinary process watching people who never saw themselves as part of a political process, all of a sudden identifying with the problems of the people of the island of Vieques. People who were sort of hardened criminals who were all of a sudden speaking with empathy about these innocent children and communities in Vieques whose lives were being destroyed by the greatest power on earth.
Coming up, Robert Kennedy Jr. talks about what he perceives to be the decline in American moral authority. I'm David Schuster. This is Talk to Al Jazeera. We're speaking with Robert Kennedy Jr.
The United States is involved in another war in the Middle East, this time airstrikes in Syria. There's the ongoing campaign against Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. What do you make of the U.S. policy and how the Obama administration is handling it?
Well, I think the Obama administration inherited a dismal situation. I think the original problem was us going into Iraq in the first place, which I think was a monumental mistake, probably the worst foreign policy mistake in American history, to attack a country that had not attacked us and that posed no threat to us. I think it's a bad use of American military power. I think that the kind of problems that that need to be solved in the Mideast are problems that don't need more guns and weapons and bombs. I think probably the more appropriate response to 9/11 would have been a commitment by George Bush to go before the American people and say, we're embroiled in wars in the Mideast because we're addicted to oil. And this is destroying our capitalist economy. We're borrowing $1 billion a day from nations that don't share our values in order to import $1 billion of oil. a day, in many cases from nations that are outright hostile to us, where we are in essence funding both sides of the war against terror through our addiction to oil. The solution is not to start dropping bombs on people. The solution is to get off of oil in this country. We need to turn every American into an energy entrepreneur, every home into a power plant. We don't have to be addicted to oil that is under other people's grounds. We don't have to kill Americans. We don't have to bomb wedding parties and spy on people with drones, and we don't have to erode our own constitution. We don't have to spend $700 billion a year on the military, more than all the nations in the world combined. Why are we doing that as Americans?
Do you see anybody in the political landscape today who is asking those questions? I mean, we think about Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren or Jim Webb or others.
I don't know, maybe Elizabeth Warren is. I think Bernie Sanders is. I think even Rand Paul is asking those particular questions.
Fair to assume you wouldn't necessarily be a Rand Paul supporter,
No,
though.
I wouldn't be Rand Paul supporter. But, you know, I believe that he has some of his philosophy has a lot of appeal to me.
Would you support Hillary Clinton again, should she run in 2016?
I love Hillary Clinton, and that doesn't mean that I agree with everything that she says. I think that that we have gone down a bad road in this country, you know, towards a kind of a warfare state and a national security state. That the real damage that was done to us by the 9/11 attacks was the damage that we did to ourselves. You know, suspending, basically treating the Bill of Rights of the United. I'm a strict constitutional constructionist, and I believe that the Bill of Rights are sacred, and that, you know, the Republicans want to treat them, and the militarists want to treat them as if they're a luxury we can no longer afford in our country, and that we can suspend a habeas corpus, and that we can torture people, and that we can spy on our own citizens and do warrantless wiretapping and investigations, and that we can suspend the ancient right to jury trial, and that we can confine people, you know, from all over the world. And I don't think it's good for America, and I don't think it's good for our security. When I was a little boy in 1965, my father took me to Europe, to France and Germany and to Poland and Italy and many other countries, and everywhere we went, we were met, even in the communist countries where the governments tried to hide that we were there, we would still be met by spontaneous crowds, some hundreds of thousands of people who would come out onto the street waving tiny American flags and cheering for my father as the surrogate for the United States of America. They loved our country. They were starved for our leadership, for our moral authority. They didn't want our bullying, and they knew the difference. And in Latin America and Africa and Asia, my father encountered the same kind of crowds, because the idealism about America's mission in the world as an exemplary nation, as a model, a template for the greatest values of humanity. And that's what we represented. And today, you know, those people no longer respect our country, and our country is widely hated. Many people want to come here for the wealth, but it doesn't mean that they admire our values anymore. And that, to me, is one of the greatest tragedies of my lifetime, that we've lost, you know, so much of our global prestige and our moral authority, and that we did it to ourselves.
Are you optimistic in the least that the United States can get back there?
Well, I think that that's where we need to be headed. You know, the job of every generation and every politician really should be to perfect the union. You know, and you know, our union has never lived up to its ideals. We passed a law, probably the most important, in 1907, that made it illegal for corporations to donate money to federal political campaigns. And that law stayed intact until, you know, 100 years later, when this particular Supreme Court, the most business-oriented Supreme Court in our history, threw it out with the Citizens United case. So, And that really has unleashed the tsunami of money from big oil and from big carbon and the financial industry and the pharmaceutical industry back into our political process. So it's hard to even claim that we have a democracy anymore in our country. It's really, it's a corporate kleptocracy. It's a plutocracy. It's governed by, the wealthy aristocracy, which is exactly the system that our European ancestors fled Europe to come to America to escape.
Robert Kennedy, thank you so much for being on Talk to Al Jazeera. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you.